If you've ever played the game Animal Crossing, you might know a bit about urban development. What is urban development? Well, it's everything around you. It's how we plan and build our cities and towns, and everything in between. It's the houses, businesses, schools, and roads in your neighborhood. Without even realizing it, it affects every part of your life. Urban development also tells us a lot about the history of our cities. After the Industrial Revolution, millions of people moved from the countryside into the city. They were looking for work in factories. There were also new ways of traveling. Before, people walked or used horses or boats. After the Industrial Revolution, there were automobiles, steamboats, and trains. People could travel further than ever before. The Industrial Revolution brought a lot of changes to American cities. City planners had to figure out where people could live, where to build buildings, and how people could travel into and around the city. These decisions are the reason why our cities look the way they do today. Now, to tell you a bit more about urban development, I'm going to tell you a story about a neighborhood in one of America's biggest cities. We're going to take a trip to Los Angeles, in sunny California, the place where Hollywood was born. This is the story of Sugar Hill.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History, and I'm extra excited about today's podcast because it's about my hometown of Los Angeles, California. In fact, the area we are discussing today is only a 10-minute drive from my house. Growing up in a big city means that there is a lot of history to explore all around you. But that history isn't always pretty. And along with the positive stories, we have to learn about the difficult stories that impact our lives today. As cities grow, they can sometimes bury important history in the process. For example, today's episode is about a story that many people living in the same neighborhood where it took place don't even know about. So as you listen, think about the city or town where you live. Like the story you're about to hear, maybe there's history around you that needs a closer look. Think of how you can keep the story of your neighborhood alive, even if it's a difficult story, so people can continue to learn from it. So, let's go ahead and learn something.
Sugar Hill is a neighborhood in central Los Angeles. Originally, and officially, Sugar Hill went by the name West Adams Heights. This land sat slightly above the rest of the West Adams neighborhood. It is one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. Los Angeles wasn't always a big city. In fact, it only really started growing about 120 years ago. Around this time, West Adams Heights was the place where some of the wealthiest families settled. And when they moved there, they built some big houses. Today, you can still see some of the grand mansions that these families built over 100 years ago. If you ever go to this part of LA, there is one house you shouldn't miss. On South Harvard Boulevard, there is a large, white, two-storied house. This house was the home of Hattie McDaniel, the famous Hollywood actress. Hattie moved into the neighborhood in 1942. This was a couple of years after she won an Oscar for her performance in the movie Gone with the Wind.
Frankly, my dear,
she was the very first black person to win an Academy Award. Hattie's home was the envy of many. One actress who visited her house said that Hattie had the most exquisite house she had ever seen in her life. Hattie's home had 17 rooms. There was a living room, dining room, drawing room, den, butler's pantry, kitchen, service porch, library, 4 bedrooms and a basement, not to mention the huge backyard. It was an incredible house, and as it turns out, it was also the perfect place to throw a party. Hattie's parties were famous. Celebrities and entertainers all gathered at her home and stayed late into the evening. Sometimes she decorated her house and yard with bouquets of fresh flowers. On her patio, guests could listen to the music of famous piano players. Inside, a music player called a jukebox blasted the most popular tunes of the time. Hattie's guests could dance the night away. Some parties were so big that the police had to come to help direct traffic on her street. Reporters loved to write about her glamorous parties. The California Eagle, a black-owned newspaper, wrote, "It has been said that when Hattie throws a party, it's a party." But Hattie wasn't the only black celebrity living in the neighborhood. In the 1940s, black entertainers, athletes, and businessmen began moving into this part of LA. This is how the neighborhood got its name. They started calling it Sugar Hill, after the wealthy black neighborhood in Harlem, New York. In the 1940s, when Hattie moved to Sugar Hill, this neighborhood was pretty unique. It was one of the few places in the west side of Los Angeles that you could find wealthy black and white families living in the same neighborhood. All across Los Angeles and in many American cities, neighborhoods were segregated. Why was this? For a long time, it was nearly impossible for people of color to buy houses in neighborhoods where white families had lived. This was because of something called racial covenants. Covenants were written into the property deeds of houses. They stated that a house could only be sold or rented to a white person. Racial covenants didn't just happen in LA. They existed in cities all over the U.S., in St. Louis, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Denver, and many more American cities. Because of covenants, many neighborhoods remained white only. Most of Hattie's neighbors knew about these covenants. As more black families moved into Sugar Hill, some of Hattie's white neighbors began to grumble. They didn't like that many of their neighbors were black, and they wanted to stop other black families from moving into the neighborhood. They also wanted to kick Hattie and all the other black residents out of their homes. In 1945, just 3 years after Hattie moved into the neighborhood, a group of her white neighbors filed a lawsuit against the black residents. They wanted their black neighbors out of Sugar Hill. Hattie and her neighbors worried. They didn't want to lose their homes, but they were ready to fight. Once a week, they met up at each other's homes to figure out a strategy. They decided to hire a lawyer named Loren Miller. He was prepared to defend Hattie and the 49 other black residents of Sugar Hill. Later that year, the black and white residents went to court. The judge for the case was a man named Thurmond Clark. It would be up to him to decide what happens to Sugar Hill. The group of white property owners thought they had a good argument. Their lawyers said that the black residents should never have been allowed to move into Sugar Hill. After the Great Depression hit America, many homeowners were desperate to sell their homes. When people like Hattie McDaniel arrived, looking for a home and willing to pay a lot of money for it, the white homeowners decided to sell. But those homes had covenants written into their deeds. The covenants promised that the houses would only be sold to white people. The judge listened to their arguments quietly. Then, it was the lawyer Loren Miller's turn to speak. He argued that racial covenants discriminated against black Americans. He used the 14th Amendment of the Constitution to prove his point. The 14th Amendment stated that all U.S. citizens, which includes black Americans, should be treated equally under the law. It didn't take long for the judge to come to a decision. On December 6, 1945, he sided with the black residents. He threw the case out of court. World War II had just ended, and many black Americans had died fighting for the U.S. during the war. The judge thought that it was about time black Americans were treated fairly. Hattie left the courthouse in a whirl of excitement. Reporters waited to hear what happened. "That's one fine judge," Hattie told one reporter. "I've still got my home." For that moment, Sugar Hill was safe. The neighborhood continued to attract famous entertainers. The Hotel Watkins opened, where jazz singers like Ella Fitzgerald came to perform. More beautiful buildings were built, and people made a point to visit their neighborhood to see the grand mansions. That court case had also started something important. The lawyer, Loren Miller, continued to fight for black Americans in the California courts. A few years later, the Supreme Court ruled that racial covenants were unenforceable. This was a huge step forward, not just for black Americans, but all people of color. Even with this victory, there was still a lot of work to do to make housing fairer for everyone. couple of years later, Hattie started to get lonely in her big house. She decided to move into a smaller home, not too far away. She threw one last party in her mansion in Sugar Hill. For 8 years, her home had been the place where people came together. With her help, the people of Sugar Hill fought against racial covenants to keep their homes. It was going to be hard to imagine the neighborhood without her. But Sugar Hill had another big fight ahead of them. In 1953, 8 years after the court case, the residents of Sugar Hill heard a frightening rumor. A freeway was going to be built nearby, and it would cut right through Sugar Hill. If you've ever visited Los Angeles, it's hard to imagine the city before freeways. Today, all across LA, people drive their cars on these giant roads called freeways. Believe it or not, these roads didn't always exist. In fact, before there were cars and freeways, LA used to have electric streetcars. Streetcars ran on rail tracks. The top of the streetcar was attached to an electric wire. This electric wire powered them to move across the tracks beneath them. At one time, LA had the largest streetcar system in the US. By the 1950s, streetcars were not as popular as they once were. Many people owned cars and drove them to get around the city, and soon enough, the streets became crowded with traffic. The streetcars had to share the roads, and instead of building dedicated lanes, planners decided to prioritize cars over public transportation. As the city of Los Angeles grew, it built new roads instead of new streetcar tracks. Many of these new roads were built from the city to neighborhoods just outside the city, to a new type of neighborhood called a suburb. Suburbs were built on the outskirts of the city, where there was more space. People were able to build and buy bigger houses, and that's exactly what they did. After World War II, many houses were built in the suburbs for American families. But most of these neighborhoods were exclusively built for white people who took advantage of things like the GI Bill, which helped returning soldiers go to college and buy a home, and government-backed loans, which were only offered to white people. To this day, white people are much more likely to be approved for home loans, and black buyers are consistently charged higher interest rates. When black Americans and immigrants moved into the city, the white residents who lived in the city packed their bags and moved to the suburbs. Today, historians call this white flight. Even after racial covenants had been struck down by the Supreme Court, housing discrimination persisted, and these new neighborhoods outside the city continued to segregate black and white Americans. But now, the people living in the suburbs wanted to be able to get to the city quickly and easily. The government built freeways to connect the suburbs to the city, making it easier for people to drive their cars to places. But these giant roads destroyed everything in their path. To make way for these behemoths, houses were torn down and neighborhoods were split in half. Many of these freeways were built through neighborhoods where people of color and immigrants lived. Freeways were something every suburban neighborhood wanted, but everyone in the city feared. When the residents of Sugar Hill heard about the freeway, some people began to move away. They didn't want to wait and see what would happen. Others decided to stay and fight. In 1954, a group of residents from Sugar Hill and West Adams got together. They created the Adams-Washington Freeway Committee. They wanted to go to California's capital city, Sacramento. There, they would ask the California State Highway Commission to build the freeway somewhere else. They wanted to save their neighborhood. Meanwhile, residents of a nearby city did the same. Citizens United of South Pasadena heard about plans to build a freeway through their town, and just like the freeway fighters in Sugar Hill, they organized to stop it. Even when they were brand new, nobody wanted a freeway cutting through their neighborhood. The difference in South Pasadena, however, was that most, if not all, of the residents were white. 3 residents from West Adams, which included a black American and a Japanese American, arrived in Sacramento. On February 18th, they stood in front of the commission to argue their case. They told the commission that the freeway would destroy many homes. It would be difficult for the non-white residents to move somewhere else, much more difficult than their white neighbors. Many neighborhoods still did not welcome people who were not white. The commission thought about what the residents said, but in the end, the commission decided not to change their plan. 9 years later, in 1963, the Santa Monica Freeway was built straight through Sugar Hill. It divided the neighborhood and destroyed many of the mansions along with it. A year later, most of the families had left their beloved Sugar Hill. In South Pasadena, however, the activists were much more successful. In 1951, construction began on Interstate 710 in Long Beach. As it was built north through cities like Compton, Downey, and East LA, the residents of South Pasadena ramped up their opposition. For years, they went to meetings, wrote letters, and filed lawsuits, ultimately convincing the commission to hold off on the stretch of freeway. Today, if you go see Hattie McDaniel's old home, you will hear the rumble of cars as they race past. Just one street over, you will see the Santa Monica Freeway. On the other side of town, however, there remains a 4.5-mile-long gap between Interstate 210 and 710. The mostly white residents of South Pasadena were accommodated, while the mostly black people living in Sugar Hill were not. When you start to learn about urban development in America, you will find more stories like Sugar Hill in South Pasadena. You will also learn how the choices people made 100 years ago affect our everyday lives. Sugar Hill may not be the place that it once was, but it is a reminder of what happened to many black neighborhoods around the country and the battles people like Hattie McDaniel and Lauren Miller fought to ensure equality for all. Think about a city close to where you live. What are the neighborhoods like? Were they always like this? Why do the people that live there live there? As you ask these questions, the history of these places may surprise you. Our cities are constantly changing. How do we make sure we change them for the better?
Hello again. Isn't it fascinating to learn about how history affects your everyday life, even if you didn't know about it before? I drive on the Santa Monica Freeway nearly every week, and until recently, I never stopped to consider the impact to the people and the neighborhoods that were torn apart to make way for the freeway. It puts things into a whole new perspective, and when those difficult issues of urban development happen again, being informed about the past will help us create better solutions for the future. We will be back soon with more fascinating tales from history, but if you are itching to learn more about the past, check out Honest History's books and magazine. From the history of Wi-Fi to the French colonial roots of the banh mi sandwich, there is something for everyone. See you next time. This episode was hosted by Don Gavitte and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistorymag.com and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.